Okay, I think we should get started. We are very happy to have with us Chris Tucker and Liz Jackson. They're going to be giving us a paper entitled Withholding is Not Accessible for Accuracy.
Thanks. And the title of the paper just kind of is the thesis or the conclusion of the paper. I mean, by withholding, some people use the term suspension, some people use the term agnosticism. It's just our term for the third full belief state that gets paired with belief, disbelief, and withholding is our term for it. More officially, the statement of our thesis is non-accessibility with respect to accuracy. It's this: subjects withholding whether P is not accessible for accuracy with respect to P. So some things are accessible for accuracy, like beliefs that could be true, false, accurate, inaccurate. In contrast, things like hats and tables and chairs, it's kind of a category mistake to say, look, my hat is accurate. That doesn't make any sense. My chair is accurate. That doesn't make any sense. Um, so our point in the paper is in some ways that withholding is more like a hat than it is like a belief, because hats and withholding, um, they're not accessible for accuracy. Now, we do allow that withholding is accessible for epistemic rationality, that it is accessible for fittingness. We just deny that for it to be accessible for rationality, it has to be accessible for accuracy. Now, anyone who endorses non-accessibility with respect to accuracy has got their work cut out for them because they must face two challenges. The first is a psychological challenge. It looks like withholding is a kind of exception. Beliefs, disbeliefs, precise and imprecise credences are all accessible for accuracy. So why is withholding the oddball? What makes it different? The epistemological challenge is again a kind of sort of like, why would withholding be an exception? Belief, right? The epistemology belief is driven by assumptions concerning truth and falsity. So, for example, reliabilism about beliefs epistemology. Uh, a belief is reliably formed only if it's the kind of thing that can be true or false. A belief is safe, unlikely to be false, or hard to be false, rather. That's sounds like it's presupposing that belief can be true or false. But then why, if beliefs epistemology would be undermined by denying that it's accessible for accuracy, why wouldn't withholdings epistemology be undermined by assuming it's not accessible for accuracy? Now, we're going to spend the most of the time talking about the psychological challenge, and we hope that if we do a good job explaining how things go with respect to the psychological challenge, that'll basically give us or take us a long way with the epistemological challenge. So that's kind of the layout of the paper. We've gotten a mix of intuitive reactions to non-accessibility. Some people have found it implausible. Most people have found it plausible. And some people have found it so plausible, it's like so obvious to them. It's like, why even write a paper about this? And I guess what I want to say is that the more obvious that non-accessibility is, maybe the better it is for us, because the bigger the problem we raise for views that we don't like. So creedal reductivism about withholding is a view that makes withholding accessible for accuracy, but if it's obvious that withholding is not accessible, then it's obvious that creedal reductivism is false. Maximizing expecting accuracy views, as Liz is going to get into, right? They say things like it's rational to withhold only if it maximizes expected accuracy, but that supposes that it's the kind of thing that can be accessible for accuracy, which, if it's obvious that it's not accessible for accuracy, then it's obvious that these views can't be right about full belief states. So that's where we're going. So the first argument that we're going to give is going to be super quick. Just call it the function argument. First premise, excuse me, withholding whether P is accessible for accuracy with respect to P only if it has the function of accurately representing P. But premise two, withholding whether P does not have the function of accurately representing P, therefore withholding whether P is not accessible for accuracy with respect to P. So in defense of one, um, it's a little bit of an analogical argument. It seems that belief and credences are all accessible for accuracy because they have the function of accurately representing their own content. So if withholding is accessible for accuracy, it would seem to be accessible for the same reason. But withholding doesn't have that function according to the second premise. And the idea here is that as we go through these three main accounts of withholding, I think you'll see that none of them really makes it clear that has the function of accuracy with respect to P. I should say, though, just to clarify the conclusion, we certainly allow that withholding exists for the sake of accuracy. It just doesn't exist for the sake of its own accuracy. It exists for the sake of the accuracy of beliefs. Okay, so in addition, to using the three main accounts of holding to defend the second premise, we're also going to use them to directly support our conclusion, namely non-accessibility. Because as we consider the three main accounts of withholding, each one of them makes withholding the kind of thing that it just doesn't make sense to say it can be accurate or inaccurate. Okay, so let's start by thinking more carefully about the mere omission view of belief and disbelief. And this is our way of trying to make sense of a lot of what's going on in the literature with people who think of withholding as a kind of absence or a lack of belief. Now, there's some sort of stock objections to the simplest views, right? Rocks, right, never believe or disbelieve, but they aren't withholding either. So withholding isn't going to be a mere absence of belief and disbelief, but might be an omission, where an omission, as we are using the term here, is a lack of a disbelief of believing and disbelieving in an epistemically accessible way. So rocks don't withhold because they're not omitting belief. They're not having an absence of belief that's epistemically accessible. Now, what you know, we're not going to be able to go into a whole lot of detail about what it takes to be epistemically accessible. A natural thought is that at the very least, you have to be engaging the question whether P in order for your response to P to be epistemically accessible. You can do that consciously. You can do it explicitly, but it could just be a sort of automated thing while you go about your day. You just happen to as you're walking down the street, you just happen to engage the question of whether there's a car coming, and indeed there is. It can be done tacitly. So if there's a way of tacitly forming a belief, not only are you engaging the question there, but you're responding to the question with belief. This way of thinking about epistemic accessibility explains why Aaron, the arachnophobe, isn't withholding. So Aaron, you ask him the question, hey, can wolf spiders jump? And he's like, no, 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 I don't want to think about spiders, right? He's avoiding the question. He's not engaging the question. He's not in position to respond one way or another to epistemic reasons or evidence. And it's because he's not engaged in the question, he's avoiding spider-related questions, that his lack of belief is not withholding. It's not an omission. Okay, so if the mere omission view or any sort of absence view is true, withholding whether P is like a refusal to answer the question whether P. So I kind of come out of the amphitheater and you ask me, how many people are in there? And I just stare at you awkwardly, refusing to answer. My refusal to answer, it's neither accurate nor inaccurate. It's just not accessible for accuracy. Withholding on this view, it's like a refusal to believe. It's being like this refusal means that it is not the kind of thing that could be accessible for accuracy. Now, there are various kinds of worries you can have about mere omission, although mere omission, as we develop it, does avoid most of or all potentially of the stock objections to non-belief accounts of withholding. There are questions you can ask about it that in connection with the absence component of it, right? If you think that you can reason to and from withholding, but you don't think you can reason to and from an absence, well, then withholding is probably not an omission or any kind of absence. It's a little unclear on how the simplest views, including mere omission, we can have our withholding stored, but then we can forget our withholding, just like we can store a belief and forget a belief. But how do we distinguish between when withholding is stored and when it is forgotten? Um, it's hard to say on this view. Also, if you, like Liz and I, think that you can believe and withhold at the same time, that's psychologically possible, even if it's irrational or incoherent. And this view doesn't make room for that. So these challenges, we don't really take a stand, but maybe they motivate the idea that withholding has to be some sort of positive state. If so, there still may be a grain of truth in mere omission. That grain of truth would be captured by something like omission as function. We do kind of think in this paper that any positive state view, if it's going to be true, it's got to do a good job of capturing something like omission as function. Withholding whether P is a state whose function it is in part to omit belief and disbelief that P. So for example, if you end up believing and withholding at the same time, your withholding is a state whose job it is to keep you out of belief, but it fails its job in this particular case. And that's how belief and disbelief, belief and withholding at the same time can be possible. Okay, so we gave our spiel about the first main account, sort of mere omission accounts of withholding, said that they lead to uh, non-accessibility. Now let's consider the sui generis accounts, which basically say that withholding is a positive state, but it's a positive state that's not reducible to any other familiar positive state. It's not reducible to belief, not reducible to intention, not reducible to credence, and so on. There are two different ways sui generis accounts can lead us to non-accessibility. One is by thinking of the sui generis state as an interrogative attitude, where an interrogative attitude, there's like two ways to be an interrogative attitude. One way is by holding that withholding's content is a question rather than a proposition. The other is to think of it, no, it really does have a proposition as a content. It's just that it's a questioning attitude towards that proposition. Either way, talk about the reliability, or I'm sorry, the accuracy of withholding probably doesn't make sense analogously. Claims like the following don't make sense. So Casey's question is accurate, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So if withholding has a question as a content, probably doesn't make sense to say withholding is accurate either. My 5-year-old, when he was 4, no matter what claim or directive was given, he always asked why. He always had a questioning attitude, no matter what you said. And he was so sincere and innocent, and he really just wanted to understand. But it makes no sense to say Benji's questioning attitude towards the proposition that the sky is blue is inaccurate. It's just not the kind of thing that it's not, you just can't assess questioning attitudes as accurate or inaccurate. So if withholding is an interrogative attitude, it's non-accessible. Okay, so one of the things we want to do here is say a little bit more about the functional role that we assign to withholding if the sui generis view is true. So on standard accounts of beliefs have a special dispositional role or functional role. To be a belief is to play that role. And if withholding is a sui generis state, it's going to have a dispositional profile that's similar or related, but importantly different, which is what makes it distinct. So what we think the functional role is, this is a little rough, but the idea is that withholding is individuated by its function to omit belief or efficiently omit belief until the chance of error is sufficiently low. And on this way of thinking about the functional role, it requires engaging the question whether the P, and it requires responsiveness to evidence. So, it's when the evidence changes in a certain way that you finally get to the point where the chance is sufficiently low that you should now believe. If this is the right way of thinking about withholding, we can explain why our psychology would be designed to have that state rather than a mere absence of belief, because it improves the efficiency of belief by having this coarse-grained state that doesn't sweat the small stuff, that it allows you to efficiently be in a state that keeps you out of belief and disbelief. It also prevents you, because the state can be stored, it prevents you from having to constantly reassess whether to believe P when P is relevant to your goals. In addition to improving efficiency, it also improves accuracy, or at the very least, it reduces the number of false beliefs that you have. So for example, the probability is 0.51. Well, P is more likely than not, but there's still a substantial risk for errors. If you believe then you're going to be more likely to have a false belief. So withholding keeps you out of belief in those cases, thereby reducing the chance of having a false belief. Now, this way of thinking about the functional role also helps us understand why Aaron's fear state doesn't have the right functional profile to be withholding, because the fear state keeps him from engaging the question and responding to spider-related evidence at all. It's not a withholding functional profile. Um, Finally, the withholding is, so if this is the right way to think about the sui generis functional role, um, we can use this functional role, we think later in the paper, to explain why withholding's epistemology is the way that it is. But if we can explain it using this functional role, then simplicity considerations are going to counsel against adding the function to withholding of accurately representing its own content. So I think Liz is going to take over now and tell us why the higher order belief view also, like the first two, leads to non-accessibility.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, cool. I'm trying to use my external mic and I want to make sure I didn't mess something up. All right, great. Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Also, Ariana, David, Dennis, if you're around, thank you so much for organizing this. It's been, a talk series I've followed for a while, and so it's fun to kind of finally be a part of it. So yeah, and also thanks to everyone here for coming. So yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the higher order belief view first and why that view, I think, joins the first two views in supporting our thesis. Chris, if you want, maybe you could scroll down on the handout a little bit. Okay, so on the higher order belief view, withholding is a type of belief. So the view will focus on it's the belief that you're not in a position to know whether P is true. And this belief also explains the subject's neutrality. So it explains the fact that they omit belief and disbelief, going along with mere omission, concerning whether P. So this specific version of the view is defended by Raleigh. Others defend like closely related views. Maybe the higher order belief is the belief that my evidence doesn't settle whether P, or I cannot rationally believe P. So you can kind of tweak the content, and that largely shouldn't matter for our purposes. But we do focus on Raleigh's version of the view. So what I'll do is mention a few quick pros and cons of this view. But then I think most importantly, explain how this view sort of vindicates our thesis. So one big pro of this view is that it is a simpler view, right? Like the sui generis view posits this like extra existent withholding, that's like this non-reducible state, whereas like we all already agree that beliefs exist, including higher order beliefs, right? So that is a benefit of the view, but I also think we have some worries that I'll just briefly mention, but both to kind of show why. So we do favor the sui generis view, so maybe just like show you why. That's not necessarily the main goal in the paper is to defend the sui generis view, but maybe a little like bonus thing. And then also, I think the worries could help like the audience understand this view a little bit more deeply. So our two worries, quickly, first is that we think this view, and this is probably the biggest worry we have, we think it over-intellectualizes withholding. So we think children, we think advanced animals, even adults that haven't like considered whether they're in a position to know whether P, or they don't have the concept of in a position to know. We think all those kinds of creatures can withhold, but this view makes that impossible. So what ends up happening with these higher order views is actually that it seems like withholding becomes this like more conceptually demanding state. Believing P is like a little bit easier, and then withholding requires like you grasp this higher order content in addition to like the proposition in question. And it just doesn't seem like withholding is like this more conceptually demanding thing, or like harder to do than believe. So just to make this concrete, a child could consider like, is dad home? And then they're like, I'm not sure, I'm withholding, right? I mean, they wouldn't maybe say that, but they would withhold belief on that. And we're skeptical that that child is forming the belief, I'm not in a position to know that dad is home. And so we think, look, either it makes withholding too hard, like children and animals, it seems like it would say that they couldn't withhold, or it's like, I guess you'll have to like say it's actually a lot easier to have the concept of in a position to know. But I'm skeptical that a lot of them actually do have that concept. So that's like our biggest worry. Our secondary worry is that it also seems like it's really hard to withhold and disbelieve at the same time. Sorry, withhold and believe or withhold and disbelieve, right? So on the sui generis view, you can withhold and believe at the same time because maybe you're like fragmented, so you like withhold in one fragment and believe in another fragment, or like in some domain you withhold even though you like maybe you're not like you're neutral in this domain but you're not neutral overall, right? But on the higher order belief view, withholding is this more like sort of overall committed neutrality among all of your doxastic states, and so at least it's harder to see why it would be psychologically possible to withhold and believe at the same time. Whereas I think the sui generis view has like a more ready explanation there. Okay, but really those objections aren't the main focus. What we really want to push here is that withholding whether P is not accessible for accuracy on this view with respect to P. Okay, so it's a little different than the first two views because this view is one on which withholding is accessible for accuracy because it's ultimately a belief, but it's not accessible for accuracy with respect to P. It's accessible for accuracy with respect to that I am in a position to know whether P. So this more like complex higher order content. So in a sense, yeah, you could like withholding is accessible for accuracy with respect to something, but it's not this same kind of corresponding content that you would believe or that you would have a credence in. And that's really the important thing for our thesis. And so it really does still sort of set withholding aside in its sort of own unique category that stands in contrast to like the contents you would have beliefs in or have credences in. So, you know, and relatedly too, I think this view can like just like showing the ways it sort of joins our project, it can capture something like omission as function. So if I refuse to answer a question because I'm not in a position to know the answer, because I believe I'm not in a position to know the answer, then I am in some sense sort of omitting disbelief, right? So, so I do think, yes, this view indicates our thesis. Yes, this view can capture omission as function. Nonetheless, for sort of other reasons that are less central to the paper, we deny this view. Okay, so that's the higher order belief view. The next view is the view that is going to be in conflict with our main thesis, and this is going to be the middling credence view. So this is, I think, probably if you were to map out the main views of withholding, probably, you know, the fourth most prominent account of withholding. And this view does make withholding accessible for accuracy, so we do concede that. But we think the disjunction of the first three views is more plausible than this view, and I'm going to say a little bit about why. Okay, so this view is the middling credence view or the creedal reductivist view. On this view, withholding is basically some kind of middling credence in between high credences that would correspond to belief and low credences that would correspond to disbelief. And as we've seen, credences do have the function of accurately representing their contents. So on this view, withholding is accessible for accuracy. We do think that this view can capture omission as function because middling credences generally are in some kind of tension, at least in paradigm cases, they're in some kind of tension with belief and disbelief. So that it has that going for it. That said, I think we worry this view is subject to a number of unanswered objections concerning things like lotteries, bare statistical evidence cases. So some of these cases will be pretty familiar to some of you, but here's like some of the cases people often give. So let's say 99 out of 100 prisoners assault a guard. All you know about Peter is that he's one of the prisoners. So a lot of people say, look, I have a credence 0.99 that Peter assaulted the guard, but I withhold belief on whether Peter assaulted the guard, right? And I think a lot of people in the literature sincerely report that this is their combination of views and actually even go on to argue not only is this the views that like the combination of attitudes that they have, but this is rationally permissible, if not even a rationally required combination of attitudes. And the thought is, look, if 99 out of 100 prisoners assaulted a guard, that like pretty straightforwardly justifies this 0.99 credence. But you don't really have evidence that like incriminates Peter in particular for assaulting this guard. So you should withhold that Peter assaulted the guard. So I think that's kind of at least a very quick motivation for why. But really here, we don't need these claims about rationality. We just need that this combination of attitudes is psychologically possible. Okay, so similarly, lottery cases, you might have a 0.99 credence that your ticket in a 100-ticket fair lottery is a loser, but a lot of people think you don't believe your ticket's a loser. Maybe you don't, or you shouldn't, or whatever, right? Similar structure of case. And then another case that is like, I think it's a different structure, but interesting and also is like a problem for this credo-reductivist view, is this disjunction conjunction argument from Friedman. So here's the general structure of the argument, and then I'll give a specific case. The general structure of the argument, this is sort of Friedman's way of setting it up. Say, take a proposition you don't have evidence for or against. Presumably you're withholding on that. And then take a bunch of those propositions. So you can add them up in long strings. If you make it a conjunction, so A and B and C and D, your credence is going to be, I guess, lower, right? And then if you make it, sorry, I think I maybe put this opposite on the handout. I apologize. And then if you make it a disjunction, A or B or C or D, your credence in that disjunct is going to be higher. But like looking at the long string, a lot of people think, no, you still withhold on the string of conjuncts, you still withhold on the string of disjuncts. Friedman and others argue not only is it possible to, but you should withhold on the string of conjuncts, the string of disjuncts. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you for fixing that. My brain turned off when I was writing this for some reason. So that's the general style of argument. Here's a more concrete case called mystery urn. This is like, I think we stole a version of this from this Del Rio paper in Noose on withholding. That's cool. If you're interested in this, check that paper out. So here's the case. All you know about some urn is that it contains at least one red or blue marble, and it contains nothing but red or blue marbles. So consider the propositions. R1, the first marble's red. R2, the second marble's red. All the way to Rn, the nth marble is red. Presumably, you withhold concerning each individual proposition, but no matter what middling credence you assign to each individual proposition, you're going to be required by probabilistic coherence to have a high credence in the conjunction and a low credence in the disjunction. Again, I got that wrong. Sorry. But hopefully you get the idea. I also, Chris and I acknowledge it's not the perfect case because these propositions aren't probabilistically independent. Ideally, there might be a better case we could use here, but we were trying to find a simple case that kind of illustrated the point well. So if you have actually a better case for us here, I would be open to that. But again, the general idea is like strings of conjuncts, strings of disjuncts you withhold on, but you could really, no matter, like, depending on how many conjuncts or disjuncts you add, your credence could go arbitrarily high or arbitrarily low. Okay. And then again, I sort of said this already, but I really want to emphasize this. This does not require these combinations of attitudes to be rationally required or even rationally permissible. It just requires them to be psychologically possible. And like all these philosophers who've thought deeply about this and like sincerely report having these combinations of attitudes, do we really want to say they're like radically self-deceived? I mean, you could say that, but we think that's pretty implausible. Okay, so here's sort of the general challenge. If you want to reduce withholding to credence, if you want to say withholding belief just is or reduces to as a matter of having certain credences, it has to be inclusive enough that pretty high credences like 0.99, right, are compatible with withholding. But a credence that high doesn't seem like it's in rational tension with belief, and it generally doesn't have this omission as function feature. It doesn't have the function of omitting belief or disbelief, right? So you can play around with the view and try to say you mean different things by middling credence, but I think we're just worried like however you play with it, you're not going to be able to capture what we think are these important and intuitive functions of withholding. Okay. As a like little add-on here, Chris mentioned this idea that part of the motivation in the literature for even positing coarse-grained attitudes like belief, disbelief, and withholding is because they're more efficient. They don't sweat the small stuff. You get tiny changes in your evidence, and if you're constantly having to like alter your attitudes, that's like a sort of taxing task. Sometimes we just believe something, and then until like our evidence like more radically changes, we can just continue in that attitude. Same with withholding, same with disbelief, right? But if you think withholding just is a matter of having certain credences, it's not clear you can capture the sort of efficiency role of withholding. Because on a reductionist view, like withholding really is just like having a middling credence. Credences, like by their nature, are going to be sensitive to all changes in evidence, precise and imprecise. I mean, that's really like part of the motivation for positing them is sometimes we have credences so we can track these small changes in our evidence, right? And so credences are just like by their nature not going to be efficient in the way the coarse-grained attitudes are. And so it's not clear if you like this is really the point Roche and Schroeder are making in that 2014 paper. Like it's just not clear if withholding is a credence, you're going to be able to capture this efficiency role withholding is supposed to play. Okay, quick literature note. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time and only talk for 7 minutes, so I'll just quickly say this. There's really two-ish views in the literature that are credo reductionist views of withholding that have been defended in the past 10 years. Actually, that's not really true because I actually think both the views aren't really clearly credo reductionist views. So McGrath defends something in this ballpark, but what he really says is like withholding is an intermediate confidence, but I don't want to assume that's a credence. I think because he knows about some of these problems we've been bringing up, right? And so he says, like, I'm going to remain neutral on what an intermediate confidence is. And so, like, look, if he says it's a credence, he runs into these problems. He could say, well, no, it's not a credence. It's something like a belief about a probability or something. And then it's like more of like the belief first view. Then he's actually going to support non-accessibility because he'll have like a higher order belief view, right? So again, McGrath's like view is fuzzy enough that it's not really clear he's an opponent. And then Scott Sturgeon has this book where he talks about withholding in like part of a chapter, but really it's not really a credo reductionist view either because he says withholding is a kind of fuzzy, thick confidence. Again, he uses this confidence term, but he's clear that he doesn't think withholding always like is always reducing to precise or imprecise credences. So it's actually not. You might think, oh, he thinks withholding is an imprecise credence, but that's he's clear that's not what he's trying to say. He thinks it's like something else. So um, there's more in the book that we can get into if you want to learn more about the view. The point is like there's not really anyone clearly in the last 10 years that's even really defended this view, or at least like the version of it that's going to be a problem for us. Okay, so given these three views and everything we've discussed so far, I think we're now in a position to answer the psychological challenge and recall that challenge. Why is withholding different than belief, credence, precise, imprecise? Why is it its own attitude? And our answer is, well, that's because withholding has a different functional role than these other attitudes. Withholding whether P does not have the function to accurately represent P in the way that belief and disbelief, precise and imprecise credence do, but its function is to omit disbelief. So because hopefully we've motivated to you all, it has this different functional role. That's why it's not accessible for accuracy. Okay, I'm going to quickly try to get through the last section in like 5 minutes and then be done. So the rational profile of withholding. This last section, we want to talk more about the epistemology of withholding. We want to, it's going to be briefer, but answer this second epistemological challenge. Again, that challenge is, does our thesis, non-accessibility, undermine the role that rational withholding is supposed to play, or the role that withholding is supposed to play in our epistemology, especially if you think part of the point of epistemology is that it's like aimed at truth or aimed at accuracy, right? So is this like, if withholding's not accessible for accuracy, doesn't that just like throw a wrench in like the whole goal of epistemology? Okay, first thing I want to say, our view is not that withholding doesn't exist for accuracy considerations at all. Like that its goal has nothing to do with accuracy. It's just not, it doesn't exist to promote its own accuracy, but it exists to help belief and disbelief be more accurate, right? What is it? What's like this safe space? It's this space that you can go that's free from error. We can sit here when our evidence doesn't tell us, okay, you should go believe, okay, you should go disbelieve. Sometimes our evidence is tied or near tied, or we don't have evidence at all. And believing or disbelieving would just be super risky, like a coin flip case, right? And so withholding does help with accuracy, but by helping us get out of unnecessarily risky beliefs. And this is connected to this thesis that I don't know, this guy named Chris Tucker, I've never heard of him, but he defends in this other paper. It's called withhold by default, right? So on the assumption that your full belief states concerning P are accessible for accuracy, you're epistemically required to withhold until the balance of evidence either favors P or favors not P to a sufficient degree. So again, when you have no evidence at all, when your evidence is tied, or it's like a near tie, like, a 0.51 chance this coin lands heads, right? In those cases, you should withhold. So withholding is a default in the sense that unless your evidence is like favoring P enough or favoring not P enough, then you should believe or disbelieve, you should withhold. And part of the reason we have that first clause is because, again, if you haven't engaged the question of whether P or you aren't in a position to respond to P, then you don't have to take any attitude towards P. So we're not saying you have to withhold when you've like Aaron, who's like won't think about spiders, like he's not required to withhold. It's not a default in that sense, right? But yeah, Chris has a paper expanding on this in a lot more detail you can check out if you want to hear more. Okay, so that's like one, I think, importantly related, like that kind of helps explain non-accessibility, the epistemology of it. Second is this accuracy stuff. So this is all related, really, but we do agree that withholding helps with accuracy. Like I said, it promotes the accuracy of belief and the accuracy of disbelief. So depending on what you mean by accuracy first epistemology, like we can endorse a version of it, okay? Withholding helps with accuracy, yes, we agree. That said, some of the people in the literature, in the accuracy first literature, want to endorse something that's like more specific, and that I think is wrong. And that's what we have in the handout, maximize expected accuracy. Chris mentioned this as well. So a full belief state is permissible only if it maximizes expected accuracy. So for credences, this might be fine. And a lot of this actually does come up in discussion of credences, and we're not here to like, I mean, I think officially we're not taking a stance either way, but like I'm fine with this principle applied to credences. We're not arguing against that. But it's just not clear this is going to work. This principle works when applied to full belief. When you like consider like a near tie case, so like you have a coin flip that's slightly weighted towards heads, so it's like 51% heads, 49% tails. All of us would agree like withholding is required in such a case, but it's not clear in that case that withholding is going to maximize expected accuracy. It seems like believing the coin will land heads would maximize expected accuracy. So you can play around with the weights, but I still think there are ways to get this problem going. So look, if non-accessible is true, withholding is never going to maximize expected accuracy ever. So it's just not the kind of thing that has an expected accuracy. And so again, it's not saying we can't endorse a broader version of accuracy first epistemology, but these specific versions discussed in the literature and honestly often discussed in like the formal literature on credences, we want to say they just can't apply in the same way to full belief. Okay, so we do take our view in this paper to be a reason to reject this specific, but I would say relatively common version of accuracy first epistemology. Also, like just an interesting side note, it suggests a further possible disunity between belief and credence, because possibly this view that like might be very central and capture quite a bit of the epistemology of credence is not going to translate perfectly over to the epistemology of full belief. All right. So in sum, our answer to the epistemological challenge is this. Our answer to the psychological challenge can explain why withholding is sort of the rational default. Keeps us safe from error. It's this, it's a safe space, right? But it does threaten accuracy first epistemology. Withholding can be required, even though it's not accessible for expected accuracy. So you might think our thesis, again, initially seems really plausible, but if you're on board, you have to deny this version of accuracy first epistemology. You have to deny creedal reductivism. And for some people, those are significant big bullets to bite. So even if our thesis by itself sounds trivial, it has these really interesting implications. Cool. So just very briefly, we argued withholding isn't accessible for accuracy. We gave the function argument. We then argued that three of the main views of withholding support our thesis, and the creedal reductionist view does not, but we think that view is false. And then we said a little bit about the rational profile of withholding. Withholding is a rational default, and some versions of accuracy first epistemology don't apply to full belief. All right, I think that's it. Thanks.